Today's special edition of Hard Talk comes from the debating chamber of the Cambridge Union Society, a fitting location for an Oscar-winning director whose films have always generated heated debate and controversy. Oliver Stone has just completed the sequel to Wall Street, the movie that gave us that phrase, "Greed is good." His films have always been fueled by anger at US foreign policy, American values and politics. And the anger is still there, but is the audience still listening? Oliver Stone, welcome to Hard Talk.
Thank you, Stephen.
You have had the best part of 4 decades in filmmaking. How easy is it to mix the anger that we see in some of your movies, the determination to say things about society and the way it works, to mix that with entertainment?
That's it's a tipping point. Every film I go through sort of a hell, especially in the editing room, to solve it. And you don't want to be didactic, you don't want to bore the audience, and the audience, especially in America, is not terribly political or historical minded. So you have to make your point simply, clearly, and get out and make it tense.
But is it possible to tell me which is the priority for you? Which matters more, getting the message home or entertaining people?
No, I'm a dramatist. I've always considered myself maybe not the greatest dramatist, but I work at people in the foreground. I concentrate on people. And the background is fascinating to me, and I do a lot of research to get the background, the spirit of the background right. Be it Vietnam, be it JFK assassination, be it Wall Street, but it wouldn't work. People are interested in people. That's what movies have always been. It's the close-up, it's the eyes. I mean, they don't go in there. They won't go in for a documentary. I do make documentaries. I've done 5, and I'm working on the 6th and 7th, but I love documentaries, but it's another form completely.
And I want to talk about your documentaries, but you just mentioned Wall Street, and I want to start in specific terms with Wall Street, and that in a way is why I talked about entertainment, because it strikes me that the problem you've had with Wall Street and now making the sequel is that the first one was almost too entertaining a movie, so that people sort of lost the message that you were trying to deliver.
Same thing is true about this one. We were in Cannes for the first international showing of it, and the same thing, almost the same, superficial, glib. It's very easy to dismiss it, but it's a lot of work to put this mountain of knowledge and background together. For example, we have 3 Federal Reserve Board scenes. No one in a movie has ever shot a Federal Reserve Board scene. Of course, we're simplifying very complex stuff. Credit swap defaults, we're doing all kinds of stuff in there and explaining it, but not trying to overburden the reviewer. But still, the reaction would be it's glib or it's superficial because they don't know. They always feel that they're smarter than, but it's not true. You're right. The first one worked, but the reviews were not good, and we did okay at the box office, but over time it became celebrated.
But one of the most striking things about the first one, and I haven't seen the sequel because it hasn't come out in the UK yet, but one of the most striking things about Wall Street was that people came away from it actually admiring Gordon Gekko, the main character, the big financier, the guy who came up with the phrase, "Greed is good." And, Michael Douglas, who played him, famously said that, if he had $1 for every time people came up to him and said, "You're the man," for playing Gordon Gekko, he said he could have rescued Bear Stearns.
No, I've met a few of those people. And some of them have made billions of dollars, and I wish I had a commission on it.
But doesn't that suggest that perhaps you got the movie wrong because people came away with a message you didn't want them to get, which is that actually being a financier in New York is fun and is a good thing to do?
Well, it is glamorous, and it has attraction, and money is alluring, there's no question, and it's sexy, and it became sexy. The whole culture of business kicked in afterward. Businessmen were on covers, there was 24-hour business news, but the point was that that Gekko, anyone in his right mind knows that Gekko is a villain, he's an anti-hero, and Charlie Sheen was the hero. Now, it tells you something about the deterioration of values in 1987, that's all. I mean, if you think about Reagan and Thatcher coming into office about 1980 and kicking off this whole wave of free market pirating, and the concept of making money was back, and it was sexy, and it was right, it was moral. But it wasn't really right what they did. They kicked off an international, frankly, a deterioration of not only of values but of wealth, because I think most of the world suffered as a result.
But if you said that in 1987, you concluded back then that there was something very wrong with this form of casino capitalism, what's the point of making a sequel? Because you're only saying the same thing again.
Well, I did it in the first place because my father was a businessman. He was a stockbroker, and he was an honest man, and he suffered. I mean, he didn't make any money at the end of his life, but he worked all his life, and I admired him. And he always used to say, they don't make good business movies. So here I was coming off Platoon, and it was highly successful, and I used my capital, so to speak, to make a movie that was counter what they were making. So I was breaking the genre, and it did well. But then, look, I never thought this stuff would go on. I thought the pendulum would re-regulate. There would be a as Alan Greenspan thought, there'd be some kind of self-correction. There was not. The thing got crazier and crazier. The millions of dollars that Gecko was dealing with became literally billions. Gecko would no longer exist in the New Wall Street. He'd be a hedge funder, and a hedge funder has to start, a big-time hedge funder has to start with $1 billion, which is $1,000 million. It's inconceivable to me and to most people. And of course, what's ironic about the reason I went into the whole New Deal was that after 2008, after that crash, it was clear when I went to Wall Street and talked to people that the banks were no longer banks. They had become the hedge funds because the hedge funders were making so much money. The banks were, frankly, not only greedy, but they were envious. And they said, if this guy can walk home with $40 million a year, and I'm walking home with $2-3 million a year because I'm regulated, they changed their attitude. And the banks no longer were recognizable to me. That's one of the central issues in the movie.
I'm interested that you mentioned your father. He came from a finance background. I'm just wondering whether the sort of psychological sort of analysis you've put into some of your movies, and I'm thinking about your presidential movies, your portrait of Nixon or of JFK, or indeed of George W. Bush, where you play around with their backgrounds, their relationships with their families, and in particular their fathers. Yeah. If people did the same thing to you, to Oliver Stone, would your films generally reflect something important about your background, and in particular your relationship with your family and your father?
Well, Stephen, that's a tough question out of the blue. You're asking me to psychoanalyze myself.
But you do it, you do it to other people, and I'm now asking you to do it to yourself.
Yeah, but I don't think that's fair. I mean, I'm not here for a confessional. I've been to 3 sets of psychiatrists at different points of my life, and in a healthy way, I've left each one at a certain time when I felt I learned what I had to learn. And I think psychoanalysis is helpful to the person, especially a writer, people interested in the concept of self and developing it. Furthermore, I would add that I have a very strong relationship with my mother, who is still living, and I put that into the movie Alexander, which was released in 2004. Alexander's relationship with Olympias and Philip is closer to my life than any of these other movies I've made. Nixon's relationship with his mother is completely different than Alexander's, and for that matter, W is a father-son story more than anything, but because in W, as you know, remember the son wants to, what we believe in Clinton, by the way, Bill Clinton supported he came up to me and said he thought I was right, is that the son was, by going to the second Iraq War, felt that he was completing his father's task, but not only that, he was more powerful than his father. He used to say, Reagan is the powerful one. My father was weak.
But what's interesting is you felt, I suppose the word is confident enough to make a movie built upon that premise about George W. Bush and about the way in which one can read his presidency and his actions as partly the result of his upbringing and his family relationships.
Yes.
But this is very sensitive stuff. As you just indicated in your answer to me about yourself, it is very sensitive, and these people are still alive. Do you sometimes wonder whether you have the right to delve that deep?
Well, if George W. Bush feels he has the right to run and impose himself on the country, I think we have the right to analyze him in any way we choose. And I think we need to know about our leaders. If there is Nixon was psychologically disturbed, as we know, and he saw a psychiatrist once. If the country had known how psychologically disturbed, they might have reconsidered their vote. In the case of Mr. Bush, we paid a tremendous nightmare price for...
Well, you're right, and no doubt he's a public figure, but equally, these are contemporary figures, and it does mean there's a special duty, does it not, to get it right, to tell the truth.
But as an artist, I have don't have the same responsibility. I'm
But you do
trying
have a
to get
license
the
to
truth.
tell the truth, do you not?
I have a license to search and a responsibility that I keep with myself. I'm not hired by the BBC or ABC. I'm not licensed by the Federal Communications Commission. I do it for my own reasons, and I try to I research, I read, I do all I can, but at some point I have to go behind closed doors with a Nixon or a Bush, and you make that intuitive leap that we all make as dramatists.
But then the question is...
That Shakespeare did too in his King plays.
Fair point, he most certainly did, but here's the question. Does the storyteller have to be, as best he can be, a truth teller as well?
I think the word responsible is semantically correct. Truth teller indicates that you know the truth, and the truth, as you know, is a very difficult objective state to reach.
But you know, I look at your movies, and I'm thinking now of JFK.
Yes.
And it's an incredibly persuasive movie. It's complex, and your sort of case, Jim Garrison, the prosecutor from New Orleans, his case about what happened and how the truth was never told about the killing of JFK is persuasive. But many people who've studied this much longer than I have say it has very little relationship to the truth. And does that matter?
No, I believe that these people are wrong. I believe that there's an official establishment that has denied and maligned Jim Garrison for years. His obituary was disgraceful. I could go into all the details of the story, but he did work very hard to prove a small thing that he saw in New Orleans, where Lee Oswald came, and he knew a bunch of people, and it was the strangest story ever.
And to cut a long story short, for those who haven't seen the movie, I mean, Garrison concluded, and your movie suggests that we might conclude too, that there was a vast establishment conspiracy behind the death of JFK.
I didn't say vast. I said there was a conspiracy that was more than one individual, more than Lee Harvey Oswald, to kill Kennedy. And that, I to this day believe, because not only have I done a lot of research, but I would point out to you that it's not just the story of Jim Garrison. Please remember the film was a complicated film, but we had another man called X. That was based on Fletcher Prouty, who had been in government. He was he was a focal point officer at the Pentagon.
So based on, but I mean, there was no.
Oh, he told me that whole story about what the movie is about. Jim Garrison in New Orleans, but what happens in Dealey Plaza? We find out through what Fletcher Prouty tells us, which is the man X. Donald Sutherland plays him. Then there's the Lee Oswald story, which Garrison doesn't get close to, but we dig up the facts that we find on Oswald. And then we combine these stories into one tale.
But what do you say to people? And one that I've read...
What I'm saying is it's not just Jim. Jim is not the sole witness.
No.
And by the way, I did talk to some 50-odd people
I know you did.
on Dealey Plaza who didn't even know Jim Garrison. So I was taking
I know you did an enormous amount of
places.
research, but other people have done an enormous amount of research too and come to a very different conclusion.
Yes.
One of them, Vincent Bugliosi,
who
I'm sure you've read. I mean, he wrote a book reclaiming history, looking again in '07 at the assassination of John F. Kennedy.
Yes.
And he said of your movie and theories like yours, he said, unless, and I'm quoting him, this fraud is finally exposed, belief will have become unchallenged fact. That is, the belief there was a conspiracy. And the faith of the American people in their institutions will be further eroded.
And they haven't been by George Bush's lies on Iraq and the wars we created in Iraq I and Iraq II and the lies in Vietnam, and frankly the lies about the communist conspiracy that I grew up with right after the war. American government's been lying to the American people steadily. I mean, why? It's outrageous of them to say that this is an exception. You know, why shouldn't the government?
But my point is this guy Bugliosi and other historians too. They're not defending a political record, they're just looking at the evidence.
But there's so much evidence of the government covering up, lying through time, in my lifetime. Why is it so difficult to doubt that they told the truth in the Kennedy assassination?